Okay, hello everyone. I'm David Reed, and I am the moderator for this panel that's looking at questions of broadband. And I hope everybody is, we're going to start right on time here. And, you know, I'll have a couple words up front here on what's motivating this webinar. This is a TPRC webinar. That is something that TPRC has increasingly been doing as we've moved to Zoom due to the pandemic. And this is the first of what will be 3 over the summer. And this all leads up to the TPRC conference, which will be virtual this year in September. So if you have questions about that, you should go to the website, tprc.org, and get more information on the conference. So with that said, TPRC, we are interested obviously in telecommunications policy issues and research. We're a bunch of wonky researchers that like to look at all these pressing issues that are important for society and drill down. And we have the opportunity to do that on one of the biggest issues that impacts almost all policy issues, in the sense it's the infrastructure that supports the internet, upon which all the different applications of the internet run. And so the current administration, the Biden administration, has put together what's called the American Jobs Plan. And this proposes a significant investment in broadband infrastructure. And we're not going to get into the debate about what is infrastructure, because I think there's general consensus here that broadband is infrastructure. But we are going to talk about a lot of elements associated with this $100 billion proposal to help address concerns associated with broadband. And the key phrase that is used with this proposal is that broadband internet is viewed as the new electricity, right? To the extent to which society relied upon electricity starting back in the 1930s to have that ubiquitously deployed so everybody can enjoy the benefits of electricity. There now is the analog that's being made for broadband. Even though a significant portion of society has access to broadband, there's still a sizable chunk that does not. And so this proposal seeks to build broadband, high-speed broadband infrastructure to reach 100% coverage, promote transparency and competition, and reduce the cost of broadband internet service and promote more widespread adoption. And that's straight from the fact sheet that was released by the Biden administration. And so we are very fortunate to have 3 extraordinarily qualified panelists here to talk about what exactly is being proposed here. Is it a good idea? Could it be improved? Are there concerns? What are the prospects that this will be successful? So I'm going to quickly introduce our illustrious panel here. I'll start with Nicole Turner-Lee. Nicole is the director of the Center for Technology Innovation. She is also the senior fellow of governance studies. And is that at Georgetown? You didn't put in. Oh, you're
Brookings, David. Brookings.
Brookings. Okay. You didn't put it in there for me.
I know. I forgot it
too. Okay. She's also an author of the Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass, which will be available later from Brookings Press. She's also the board chair of TPRC, and immensely has done a terrific job with TPRC in leading it over some difficult year with the pandemic. So all of us are grateful for that service. A second speaker is Chris Lewis. He is the president and CEO at Public Knowledge. Prior to being there, prior to being elevated to president and CEO, he served as their vice president from 2012 to 2019, where he led the organization's day-to-day advocacy and political strategy on Capitol Hill. He also has served 2 terms on the Alexandria City Public School Board. So thank you for that service. That's always appreciated. And he worked at the FCC as in the Office of Legislative Affairs, including as its deputy director. And then finally, we have Randolph May, if you look for his publications. He's the founder and president of the Free State Foundation, which is an independent nonprofit with a market-oriented think tank that was founded back in 2006. Prior to that, he was the senior fellow and director of the Communications Policy Studies at the Progress and Freedom Foundation, which is a DC-based think tank. And he also served as Assistant General Counsel and Associate General Counsel at the Federal Communications as well. So we have, we're going to draw upon a deep well of experience here to talk about this proposal. And the structure for this is I'm just going to focus on what we know from the fact sheet, which is basically what we know. So, you know, that if you have questions, please send them through chat and I will try to get to them as I can. And with that, I wanted to start with just some big picture discussion points here of what this proposal is trying to accomplish. And the first one that's immediately apparent, given this analogy to electricity, is, you know, it's associating broadband with the notion of utility service. And so I want for the panelists to kind of opine on, do you agree? What are the pros and cons of this characterization? Is this setting this in the right direction, you believe, for success? And so I'll start with you, Nicole. And
So, you know, thank you, David. And again, thank you for folks being here. And I'm really happy to be around friends that I've known for many, many years in this space. So, you know, it's interesting because I've been asked that question a lot. And many of us who have been in this space have been talking about, you know, whether or not we should actually have broadband as utility for years. I mean, going back to my 20 plus years in this space, we've actually looked at the utility model of broadband from the standpoint that we know we have to solve this issue of universal service. But I recently testified in the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. And one of the things that I said as I thought more and more about the Biden proposal is, are we actually framing this the right way? When we begin to look at broadband as a utility, we almost equate it with electricity and water. And on this particular hearing were representatives from people from Flint who were dealing with water as infrastructure, people from the ports who were dealing with that as infrastructure, people from transit authorities dealing with that as infrastructure. And in my mind, I started thinking, are we belittling or limiting the capacity of broadband when we look at it as a very static utility? And the extent to which we have electricity that basically creates a conduit between points, what we actually now see, particularly with the pandemic, with broadband, it is not just about an A to Z point, but there are going to be variations of use when it comes to broadband applications. And so as I think about this concept of really placing broadband access in a box, I have to tell you, I get a little concerned, particularly when I'm sitting on a panel with a woman from Flint who is talking about the utility of water that is poisoning the people there. And so I think it's important. This is something I've actually really wrestled with my book. How do we look at something that has become much more dynamic, much more innovative in its growth as a result of it not being under utility regulations? And to what extent are we confusing and conflating the terms of utility regulation with universal service? And how do we begin to unpack that argument so that we do not create broadband in the static space where we actually, you know, in some ways, and I know Chris will differ, but there may be, you know, the opportunities that come upon us where we actually create second-class broadband access and service because the government is involved. And so I just want to put that out there because I know for many of us, even those of us on this panel, including you, David, there's this idea, and this pandemic made it really serious, right? That we need to have universal access for all. But I think getting caught up into the framework in which we provision that service and equating it to electricity that was developed in the third, you know, so long ago, to me, might take away from the dynamism that actually broadband access provides to communities that are most in need, and particularly those that experience a range of overlaying systemic inequalities. So I'll stop there and happy to talk more about it. But it has been something that for myself has really taken me towards a universal service reframing of this versus just looking at a regulatory framework in terms of how we solve this.
Interesting. Okay, Chris, and I'll turn it over to you. I would note that apparently the chat may be disabled, so use the Q&A for your questions, not the chat. Okay, Chris.
Great. Thank you, David. Good to be here with my friends, Nicole and Randy. Appreciate you guys inviting me. Utility service, if you just take how the public views broadband, just to start, broadband access, internet access, the public views it as a utility. Why do they view it as a utility? Why is the public, if you poll them, saying that it's a utility service? It's not because it's an equivalent to an exact equivalent to electricity, but it's because, I think, because of the nature of the service. One, it's expensive to deploy. Everybody knows it's expensive to deploy. That's why certain rural communities don't have it. Two, because of the cost to deploy, we're not seeing much competition in the marketplace and choices for consumers. So, if you use the FCC 25.3 standard, 25% of folks have 0 to 1, high-speed option for high-speed broadband. But most importantly, why I think people view it as a utility and why you're seeing this rhetoric now, is the essential nature of the service to our lives. And so, Nicole's talking about a universal service framework. Making sure everyone's connected takes actual oversight, takes actual regulation. Right now, we have no one with authority over broadband service to protect consumers. And what does that mean? That means that not only can companies choose which neighborhoods and which blocks they deploy to, but it also means that there's no check on whether or not the lack of choices in the marketplace are creating imbalanced monopoly pricing or other sorts of price gouging. We haven't even done the research, this is TPRC, we haven't even done the research to study what actual costs of broadband are and what actual prices are being offered, and to look at that marketplace. That's the work of our legislators or perhaps an FCC to do, but there's no one with the authority to do that. So, the essential nature of the service, it's important for people being connected to jobs and employment, healthcare, education, as well as emergency communications, since all of our communications are now converging onto all internet protocol networks. This is why people say it's essential, and this is why they say it's a utility. It's not a direct comparison to electricity, but its essential nature is just as important to people's lives. And I think that's why we're hearing that. And then how you structure the laws and the rules around that essential utility service is that's where the hard work is. That's where policymakers have to make sure that it's appropriate for the type of service it is. That it's not just, am I getting power, am I not getting power, but what's the quality of that service? Not just speed, but latency and other factors, the reliability of the network. These are all things that we think that should be factored into whether someone's getting quality service. And so, when people say it's utility, I tend to agree with them. It doesn't mean that the regulation of it has to look just like the regulation of power or water.
Okay, thank you very much. Randy?
David, thank you. Thanks to TPRC for doing this and inviting me. And, it really is good to be with Nicole and Chris. I've always been pleased to have them at Free State Foundation conferences because I appreciate their perspective, even though in some ways I disagree with it. And so it's good to be together. And I want to make a few observations because we're going to move on and drill down more specifically. I associate myself more with Nicole's remarks than Chris, and especially, a couple of times Nicole used the word dynamism, I think referring to the space, this broadband space. And I don't think, and I agree, I've often say that myself, that it is a dynamic space. I think it's, it's obviously not competitive in the way the classical wheat market is, but broadband is increasingly competitive. It's not everywhere, I get that, but and that affects how you address the public policy issues we're going to discuss, concerning subsidies, but it's increasingly competitive. And I get nervous and have always really objected when broadband is compared to utility, to make the point, which usually it's the rationale for suggesting the analogy that it ought to be regulated more or less like electricity. I don't think I'm not an electrician, but I don't think anyone, ever characterizes electricity as being a dynamic marketplace in the way that Nicole did. And here's something, when you think about how markets operate and how these services operate, that I think is worth considering. Again, as far as I know, electricity, when you sign up for it, it's delivered in, one package. You don't choose between different speeds and different features in the way that you do with broadband, as I understand it. And also, and this is an important difference, broadband is offered over different technological platforms. We have fiber, cable, wireless, even satellites. We'll talk maybe more about those. That's not true to the same extent of electricity, and it's that platform. It's the fact that you have the service that can be offered over these platforms in a dynamic environment, which differs. So again, I just close, this way. Even before I did those things that David mentioned when he was introducing me back in the 1980s, David and others, I used to spend quite a bit of time trying rate cases. I didn't say rape, I said rate cases, utility rate cases, before state public utility commissions. That's trying to determine the cost, the revenues. Chris said, we don't know what the cost, of broadband are. We don't know what the revenues are. Chris, I'll tell you, I sat through months of hearings sometimes, and at the end of the day, it wasn't very clear what those things are. So it is really, particularly in a dynamic environment, that would be a difficult thing to do. And I really worry about the aspects of the Biden plan that seem to intimate that there ought to be some form of rate regulation. We can talk about that more, but that's a worry. So I'll stop there, David.
Okay, thanks, Randy. So very nice positioning of different comments here. And we do have some questions lining up. So what I'm going to do now is go into digging deeper into each question, and maybe on each one of the pieces of the paragraphs in the proposal, really, and then we'll address some of the questions that are coming in on Q&A. For the panelists, if you've kind of had your initial framing comments, so try to keep your comments that are answers to a couple minutes or something, so we can move through and get to some questions too, because there's a lot of interest here. So let's start with on the building broadband infrastructure to reach 100% coverage. So President Biden's plan prioritizes building future-proof being in quotes in my question, but it's part of what is described in the plans, future-proof infrastructure to 100% coverage to everyone. So in your view, what does this mean? Is this consistent with the technology neutrality, or is it implying something else? What are the implications for funding efficiency? Do we really have any good data yet on exactly who has it and who doesn't? And so what are the issues that arise out of this very important plank or pillar of this plan? And Chris, I'll start with you and again, let's try to keep it a couple, 2-3 minutes. And
Try.
yeah.
Yeah. Simple answer to, do we know where it is and where we have it and where we don't? The answer is no. I think all of us know that we need to continue to improve our map so that we're putting any investments out there that the government does fund efficiently. And that's clear. The future proofing, it really gets to what sort of networks do we want to build, right? And when I hear future proofing, I hear that we don't want to be wedded to the current standard we have. The 25.3 standard is not sufficient when you're talking about multiple people in a household having use or needing use of the internet with high bandwidth uses like real-time video, and especially with the introduction of Internet of Things, where multiple devices are now planning to be attached inside homes. So we need to definitely raise the standard. That doesn't have to cut across any sort of principles of technical neutrality if technological neutrality is important to you. But the standards certainly can be raised. And when we hear reports about recent tests of 5G mobile, producing 100 down and 20 up speeds, I think that shows you that there are different ways to get high-speed broadband that's well above the 25.3 standard deployed. So, people are thinking about what they need. And I think that's why you're talking about networks that can be easily upgraded, not old copper networks continuing to be used and not upgraded.
Okay, Randy.
Thanks, David. Look, I get nervous again with the notion of future proofing, not because I disagree with Chris that ultimately we need to have our broadband become faster, more reliable, and so forth, or that I think the standard should be increased. But I would say this: the reason I'm especially nervous when you talk about future proofing in the context of legislation, or even when the FCC talks about it, if you you try to establish a regulatory standard or benchmark or whatever that matches some aspiration about the future, the real world effect of that really may well be to affect the goal of technological neutrality, which I do think is important. I mean, it's important because I think ultimately the markets and the consumers drive ultimately where broadband ought to go. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be some regulatory oversight, and that's not what I'm saying. But when you embody concepts like that, let's say in the legislation, it was specified that broadband is defined as 100 up and 100 down, right? That's considerably, of course, higher than our current standard. Well, as I understand it, that really would favor one type of platform, I think fiber, or one type of technology. It would be very difficult for cable, 5G, as Chris just said, of course, satellites, to meet that standard. And now, of course, the standard is going to be used for important things like directing subsidies. But here's a key point. And when it's used that way, what happens is that you may not be using those funds to support technologies that most efficiently and most effectively do the job that you're trying to do to increase deployment, make deployment more ubiquitous by getting them to certain places. For example, 5G in rural areas, there's a real effort now, and there's thought that that's going to efficiently and more efficiently and effectively perhaps serve those areas than fiber. Cable has a pretty widespread national footprint. Doesn't go every place, but cable, as I understand it, can efficiently and effectively in a lot of places just can extend the footprint to cover more. So anyway, without delving further into the engineering of it, I would just say you've got to be really careful about embodying these aspirational notions into legal, into legislation or regulatory constructs that have effects in terms of interference in the way the marketplace is developing.
Yeah.
Nicole?
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting question. I think it's one that for both Chris and Randy, I actually agree with both of their points, the person who was speaking last. But I want us to think of this concept of future proof as I've seen it in this Biden plan, that it really should be without constraints. I mean, the bottom line is that we have seen historically the types of investments in technology that preference one type of technology over other. And over the years, we've not just seen 5G, we've not just, or the Gs, I call them, we've not just seen cable, but now we're seeing TV white space. And one of the nice things when I was actually working on my book is I got a chance to go to places in rural America that are using TV white space, places that are primarily using cables, places that are using satellite. And having seen that firsthand, what it says to me is that this principle of technology agnosticism is important. People are going to have to figure out at this point where there are scattered Post-it notes along the wall of what type of technology we're going to deploy. We have to move away from wholesaling programs that only provide funding to one technology over the other. I give a perfect example in Garrett County, Maryland, where some people are aware of, where there's a white space technology solution where they're using vacated television broadcast channels. I've known about this for many, many years. Mike Calabrese is on the board. He has taught me about everything about TV white space. But when I saw how it actually worked in a 5-room school, how I saw how it worked with a mechanic who was not able to get broadband in a very rural community where there's more cows than people, it's convinced me that we keep staying in this argument. And I see a little bit of this in the plan that it's only about fiber, and it's not. So I think that's one thing to think about. I think also when we think about future proofing, we all know in this country, because of the insufficient and inadequate maps at the national level and the insufficient and inadequate maps at the local level, the fact that there were school districts that had no idea who was serving their communities is a failure on the part of us having the available data to know where we're connected. We also need to think about ways in which we harness that data to put the investments in places that need it the most. And so I think, again, in this plan, as we think about what technologies work, there's going to have to be, as we move into this next iteration, David and Randy and Chris, of broadband discussions, how do we collect the data in ways that allows for some type of tailorization of the type of technology solution that we have, and which of those solutions will be cheaper, and where will it be the case that we may want to do the type of standard speeds that Chris is talking about, but we don't even have any speed. So we may have to start from scratch to actually install those networks. And so again, one of the beauties of working with all of you and then also having a year before the pandemic and then after the pandemic to talk to thousands of real people is that for them, the conversation that we're having in DC has restricted, even for some of the providers, their ability to find the type of funding they need, even if they're connecting a 500-person town, because we're sort of sticking on the preference of fiber or sticking on the types of technologies that have worked in the past, but do not represent the full gamut of how we're connecting people today. So I'll just leave it there, but I like the idea of future proof as long as it's not sort of equated to the restraining or the constraints around the types of deployments that we have once we actually have the available data of where we need to connect people.
Okay, and I did just as the engineer here,
Yeah.
I want to note that and Washington can define whatever they want in terms of standards, but it's technically a definition of broadband. I just don't want to connect any connotation that it's actually a technical standard that's a due process, but it is a standard in the general definition of the word, but from a telecommunications perspective, we also obviously have technical standards as well. Another kind of a key pillar and important question that I want to ask you is associated with the plan and how it prioritizes support for networks owned, operated by, or affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, and cooperatives. And with the notion that these providers have less pressure to turn profits and with a commitment to serving entire communities. So does this go beyond eliminating the muni entry barriers to favor subsidy that is directed to these entities? And if so, whether reverse auctions have been a mechanism that have been used to try to, take some of the subjectivity out of assignments and leave it to some market forces. But would that mean that we have bidding credits or set asides for reverse auction with these support or something else? Or, what are your thoughts? Now, look, this is a question, we don't know the details here. So, it's not something that we can address with certain knowledge, but it's an interesting policy point to debate from the perspective of how various policy principles would be put into place for how this subsidy would be assigned to different players. So start with you, Randy, or no, wait, yeah, Randy, right?
That's my turn to go first.
Yeah.
Thanks, David. Yeah, well, look, I worry about this supposed prioritization. So I guess that's 3 times now I've started out by saying I worry. There are three things I'm worried about. And I guess maybe I'm a worrier, but yeah, here's the thing. And I've written a lot and talked a lot about municipal broadband. And one thing I always say is I am not opposed to there being municipal government-owned broadband in certain situations where there's no other service and there's not likely to be service. There's not a near-term prospect of service. So, I can get that out of the way. But on the other hand, I don't. I think as a general proposition there, and I believe it's supported by a lot of evidence, TPRC folks out there can always do more. But I think back to Christopher Yu's study, I forget his associate's name, but he had a paper on that was pretty rigorous in looking at the financials of the then existing muni systems. And again, I remember there were a lot of them, but the basic conclusion of that paper, if you go back and look at it, was that at least half of them, the ones for which he was able to get the data, showed that they were never going to be profitable, and that the taxpayers or the bondholders would lose money. And then for the rest of them, and I always remember this figure, they found that it would take, I think, 60 years on average for the other ones that wouldn't go under to be profitable. So, and we could name the names of some of the various cities where there've been issues, but I particularly worry about the notion of, and we don't know what it means, but prioritizing municipal broadband, if that means that that's where the subsidies are, would be directed versus others. I think the problem is, it's a fundamental problem when you have a government-owned system. That government-owned system, in a real sense, is both a regulator to some extent and a competitor for any private system that might exist or might think about coming in and participating in that market, because the government has the control over usually the rights of ways, the permitting fees, those things that are important to a private network getting up and running. So, I wouldn't want to see any prioritization become a matter of policy. And then finally, I would just say at this point that I think, as a legal matter, putting on my lawyer's hat, that I think there are constitutional objections really to the government favoritism of municipal systems over private systems. And then this final point, there seems to be an implication in the plan, we're all implying, but there does seem to be an implication that the federal government, that the law, Congress should preempt state laws which currently limit municipal systems or restrict them in some ways. There are about, I think, 18 or 20 state laws that do that. I've written, and I believe that would be not legal to do that. I don't think that part of the plan would survive, judicial review.
Okay, Chris, do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. The benefit, first of all, the idea that, because there's risk involved in the investment by local tax dollars, that risk needs to be taken seriously by local officials. I know, as someone who's been a local official and is, authorized millions of dollars in infrastructure projects and building schools, folks take those investments seriously, and there are right ways to do them and there are wrong ways to do them. And my friend Chris Mitchell at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, he's studied who has successfully done muni and who hasn't, and hopefully folks learn lessons from the right way to roll out these projects. Doesn't mean that the private sector gets it perfect either. And you can look at companies that are struggling now with their networks and with their finances. So the reason municipal or co-ops or other local private-public partnership efforts are important is because these communities can't wait any longer. Nicole talked about how COVID has made this. People have been talking about and asking for high-speed broadband for years, over a decade in some communities. How much longer do they need to wait? Especially when we've had subsidies in the past given to companies and they have not used them to deploy to these areas. This is why you're seeing states like Arkansas roll back their rules against having municipal fiber, because people are tired of waiting for industry to take their money, their tax dollars money, and invest it in bringing them broadband. So they're willing to have the option of giving it to local government or co-ops or public-private partnerships that are led locally. And I think that's a good thing. The other benefit is the competition benefit. I don't have the problem that Randy has with bringing in local government who has, controls the rights of way, because you also have the opportunity to bring them in as an open access network or as a wholesale network, which can bring competition and choices for consumers. And that's a real positive. Many local communities may not want to be in the business of being the ISP, but by lowering the cost of deployment, by getting those upfront infrastructure costs done, doing the digs, running the conduit, that could open up much greater access for consumer choices by then leasing out the fiber or leasing out that conduit. So there's real options with municipal. I understand that's why they put it in there. I'm not sure if they're going to have some sort of priority or not, or if they're going to separate it into two different options. Just to, but it's important that it's in there because communities can't continue to wait for a company to decide to bring broadband to them, even when they haven't, when there's subsidies available.
That's an interesting comment, Chris. I hadn't thought of associating maybe an open access requirement associated with the funding or something.
It could be a requirement. It could be an option. I mean, I live in Alexandria, Virginia, inside the Beltway. We have one choice for high-speed broadband, one choice. And that's why our local government has invested in a fiber backbone to our anchor institutions, our government and school buildings. And the hope is that that can lower the cost of bringing competition and lease out the dual conduits that are being dug into the ground right now. Because you cross the line into Arlington or into Fairfax County, those of you who are local and know the area, you can get Fios, you can get Cox. You can't get it in Alexandria, Virginia, and we've been begging for them to bring their services to us.
Okay. Nicole?
Chris, come to Fairfax. That's all I have to say.
Not
even though I'm on a high-speed broadband network and my computer just crashed, but come to Fairfax. I would just say on the municipal broadband piece, and I'll share this just in my earnest as a person who was working on these projects almost 20 years ago. For people who know me, they're challenging. I mean, and I think I probably know what both of my colleagues said with regards to their support or lack of support for them. That you have to have government as an anchor institution to have a successful economic model for municipal broadband. If you date back 20 years ago with Earthlink, of which I was in Chicago and I was experiencing that firsthand when I was at One Economy, it became very difficult. And we look at the internet today and we start to think about some of the resiliency and privacy concerns. I can only imagine what that looks like. That is not to say, though, and I think Randy does make a good point on if there are communities where there are no options, that we should not in any way not allow communities to put in the type of government-owned networks. But what I have also found interesting that we don't put a lot of play on are these collaboratives. I have an event coming up in Brookings with Keith Gabbard, who was on an NPR news show with me, who talked about his mule that went to the top of a mountain in Lexington, Kentucky to actually bring fiber optics. I'm a city girl. I've been around the country talking to people. A mule with fiber optics in the casing really is something I think is interesting. And he said it was a $50 million network that he had to build where he provides $40 a month to the people that live in that area. And so I think it's important for us, again, going back to the future-proof conversation. I think we're all kind of going back to what I said earlier, that this is a dynamic space. And I think it's really important as we go forward, we think about, well, is it municipal broadband? Is it this? Is it that? What does the marketplace look like in terms of, and I agree with you, Chris, on the point that we do need to find ways to engender more competition, the same way that we need to stop saying that there's not, broadband options in urban as there are in rural, right? We need to sort of debunk all of that, because what we're dealing with right now is the pandemic demonstrated that the access to technology is not as ubiquitous and universal as it should be. But this is not a moment to be prescriptive to solve that problem. I think we need to figure out, I love the example you give in Alexandria. If government is going to be part of digging in the fiber to be able to provide more competitive options, well, we want government to play that part. There may be some areas where we have enough competition, and maybe the conversation is not about whether or not we should give people to the opportunity to build more. Maybe we need to go back to the questions that we talked about earlier, which is quality of service. Maybe we need to think about pricing. I just think that when we start to bring back this conversation of 20, 25 years of municipal broadband, it worries me, because the conversations we had then, not to say that they would not be more advanced, but we all know what the ingredients are for successful municipal broadband networks. And we also know 20 years later that we have a competitive plate of choices that we should be looking at equally to ensure that we're getting access to where people need it the most and where they can narrowly tailor some options that work for their communities. And I'll just say one more thing, David. I don't want to usurp this, but I'll give another example. When I was in Nebraska, there was a guy that was at Gus Hurwitz's roundtable on rural broadband, young guy. And he made this comment. He lives in a town of 500 people. And he said, I'm not taking any government funding for this wireless network that I'm actually putting up for my 500 people. I've essentially leased everything that I own. My wife, my house, my car, but not my wife, right? To get 500 people access to broadband. And I remember asking him, well, do you get government support? And he said, no, this is something that I'm doing because my community needs it. And he said, and I would not qualify for that support. And so that to me has been a tickler for me, because I think we've not seen, and again, with the lack of data, that people are actually doing these things, and we cannot pick winners and losers in this marketplace.
David, can I make a quick
Sure.
observation here? Because I know we'll probably move on to questions, but just, I've said I've worried about the 3 or 4 things, but I can state this positively. Nicole, one thing I'll say, I've known you for so long, and I know how much expertise and experience you have, which you're demonstrating right here today, but you said a couple of times you've been doing this for 20 years and you look so young. But
I know.
You look so, I don't know how, it didn't work that way for me, but
it's the melanin.
I know it's true because of your, but anyway, that's good. But I can in some fundamental ways sum up sort of the way I think about this big important question we're talking about. And then a lot of things fall into place from that. And because it's my belief that, number one, I agree broadband is infrastructure. I think it's appropriate for the government to be directing funds now to support broadband. I've got a question about the size of the size of this. I mean, I think it's too large. Remember back in 2008 or 2009, whenever they passed I think it was called American Recovery Act and Reinvent Act, there was $7.2 billion at that point for broadband. And I think some of the post look back showed that, it didn't really get all spent effectively. And that was 7.2 billion. But here's the way I always think about these things, or this particular thing. I think we need to carefully target these subsidies to unserved areas really first. I mean, I just say that clearly. And that's the deployment side. And then we need to carefully target subsidies to low income people in need, or however, I'm not trying to define, exactly where the break point is. But I worry if the subsidies get too far up, really the income scale, that they're always, money doesn't really go on trees, and it comes from other resources. But, as Nicole knows, and Chris, I've for about 20 years, at least, as long as you've been doing this, Nicole, I've supported the FCC's Lifeline program. I've said it needs to be a robust program. I've used that word. I've supported it. But it needs to be. I know it needs to be updated, and I understand that. I support that. But I did that because it was directed to those people that really need it, really, and I thought there ought to be limits going up the scale. So those are important principles in terms of the way I think about a lot of these things that we're talking about.
And look, David, that's a huge accomplishment for Chris and I. Randy agrees with some parts, Chris, that we actually said. So I think we made a lot of progress.
I talked about his Lifeline position years ago. I'm looking for more, Randy.
So transitioning to some questions here, there are some questions and debate kind of going on the Q&A a little bit. And if you could now, within the context of everything that's been said, maybe some of you could restate or refocus some of the questions. There's a lot of debate going on about what I call the definition of broadband, which is an area I think is of immense importance. At TPRC this last year, I convened a lot of the authors of the National Broadband Plan to say, all this money is coming in for how we're gonna, spend on broadband as a universal service, but we don't have a plan anymore. It's kind of outdated. It's been 10 years back. Do we need a new one? And so, or do we just need more focus on the part of the FCC to put together a strategy that there's a vacuum that's left now from 10 years outdated from the National Broadband Plan. So, with those questions on the speed and the like, yes, cable can do 100/20, 100 down, 20 up fairly ubiquitously now. So that clearly is something that is more capable, but there's more now as there's this concept of universal service, Nicole, as you were saying, right? That how do you want to define that? And Chris, to your point, reliability might come in, but how do you want to do that? And I'm not sure in the past we've kind of been able to, with the old telephone network, tackle that well. So, but for those that listening, if you can resubmit some of the questions, I will start with one question here, and no, you don't. For the panelists, you don't have to answer. From Professor Hazlett, what's the track record of all these big bucks that we've spent in the past on voice and broadband since the Telecom Act of '96? Have we learned some lessons here that we should be thinking about going forward?
Well, I'll start. And hey, Tom, I think part of, and to your question too, David, in terms of the Universal Service Fund. So I've been putting out there, people have been reading it probably, this Tech New Deal, when it comes to what we're trying to look at with regards to infrastructure. So I do agree that Chris is completely right that we do need oversight. The Clyburn-Klobuchar bill is actually putting in an oversight committee, I think, at the agency, the Department of Commerce, which I think would be really interesting, even though I'm still sort of trying to distinguish how it's different from MTIA. But I think the goal is to come up with some metrics. So here we have another down payment on broadband, but this time I think it's different because it's now broadband being leveraged in the middle of economic recovery. So I do think it's important for us to think about, to your point, what does this mean for the implications of universal service? When you have 50 million school-age kids go home and 15 to 16 million of them not have either home broadband or a device, and 9 million not have either, and 12 months of kids sitting out because schools could not solve that, then we've not done a good job with universal service. That means the money was not immediately available, and I put out some proposals about thinking about putting money of universal service on the national treasury and making broadband insecurity like food insecurity and housing insecurity. But then there's also this opportunity for research to look at the contribution factor. So in this New Deal era time that we're in, I think we really as a community need to move into a place where we not only just look at infrastructure and adoption, but we also match the credibility that has to go into workforce development and local investments to get at many of the issues that the three of us have talked about. I think in the absence of the additional monies that are going to be needed to connect the entire country, which we already know is $1 trillion price tag, it's important that we continue to err on the side of these multiple solutions, but more importantly, that we finish this map. To Tom's question, I don't think we know where we are with this stuff because we don't have the sufficiency of a map that allows us to look at the metrics and understand what is going on. Yes, Chris, I am so with you. What we saw in this pandemic was a complete market failure on the part of not the networks that are allowing us to do this, but the holistic positioning of broadband as part of the very essential services that we provide in this country. So I think going back in this conversation, if we're going to close the divide for real this time, I think it is important that, to Chris' point, we have oversight. But I don't think that putting more regulatory constraints on this is the solving factor. I think complementing where universal service can pick up, complementing where there are gaps in actually the types of funding that we need may actually be the answer. So I'm not going to say the whole thing because you all got to buy my book when it comes out because I'm talking about these and other ideas. But I do think, having seen this in action, and somebody told me the other day, I'm like that person who's been sitting in a closet waiting for the digital divide to actually become to the forefront. And here it is. So I'm ready to talk about it like a Black Baptist preacher that's not going to shut up. But the key thing is we've got to be much more framed in this, or else we're going to put out money that is not, as Randy said, go to not just the underserved, but the poor folks that are sitting in the Black Belt or in areas on tribal lands that cannot get access to this money because they've not been part of the equation.
So,
David, just quickly, I mean, I think we all agree we need better maps, of course. I mean, that's indisputable, and hopefully we'll get there. That's really important. Maybe we should have done better a lot sooner, but we need to get there. One thing I was saying, I don't think Nicole necessarily meant it this way when she referred to the pandemic, but at least the way that I think about it from my own perspective is that U.S. broadband networks did pretty darn well during this pandemic. And especially compared, we saw over in Europe where there's tends to be a heavier regulatory overlay or regulatory environment that they were not capable as the U.S. networks of handling the increase in traffic. But that doesn't mean that it don't have these areas that we've all talked about that we need to get broadband to them. And of course, during the pandemic, the need became that much greater. I think we would all agree on that. But I think we do need to acknowledge that, hopefully we're coming out of the pandemic. And my view is that, wow, I'm thankful that we had all of the investment in networks, mostly private networks that enabled us to do all the things that we all did, during that period. And we just have to go forward now and address to the extent we can these remaining digital divides that we have.
And if I can, David, real quick, Randy, I was in no way saying that the network failed. So I want to just clarify that. I was saying that we as a country failed because it exacerbated the systemic inequalities that people, like Larry Irvin has used this term digital poverty, which I think is interesting, right? It actually exacerbated the inequalities that were under the surface, where broadband could have the accessibility and the easy transition to broadband and the understanding of digitization by this country could have actually helped us in economic stability.
And so Chris, as you, to add anything, but could you also add in your answer here, about the digital equity question as well, like Nicole's talking about?
Because that's where I wanted to add in about what we have to, to Tom Hazlett's question about what we learned from our track record. Our track record is one of a lack of care or political will for people who are left out. So while some people's networks worked well during the pandemic, other people, there are reports of other people who had outages. And again, we haven't had the political will in Washington to fund or have oversight to make sure that the digital divide is adequately addressed. And that's the lessons of the National Broadband Plan. I mean, if you talk to Blair Levin, like, you get a beautiful plan in a book, but he's like, Congress missed the window to actually fund it. I would argue that add to that, which he's right, we also missed the opportunity to make sure that everyone benefits from that funding. And that's the opportunity that we have right now, because there's a commitment, a bipartisan commitment, although the number changes depending on who you talk to. It's a bipartisan commitment to fund broadband. What needs to be added to this is the equity piece. It's not just deploying to areas that are rural and don't have the promise of return on investment, although that's important. It's not just low-income people, although that's very important. It's also the rules that make sure that a broadband provider that gets funding can't leave a neighborhood behind. Digital redlining is real. It's been studied in multiple cities. And the worst example of digital redlining is the decades-long leaving out of tribal communities, where they have asked, just like Alexandria, my town, asked for providers to come in and provide service. And they've said, no, we don't think it's worth the investment to give it to you. If you're going to take federal dollars to deploy broadband, then you need to serve everyone. And if that means setting up service areas to say that everyone in this area must get served, so be it. But there are so many people being left out for equity reasons, by choices that are made by industry, because no one's going behind them and saying they have to serve everyone in a neighborhood, or they have to serve everyone in a service area. And they have to serve everyone with a certain quality of standard and a reliability of service. So there's so much work that has to be done on the regulatory and oversight side. And this is why you have people begging for it to be classified as a utility, because they know that when the government has the political will to do that, that there's someone that they can call that's actually holding these companies accountable.
And if I can, David, I think everything that we talked about is fine. A person who focuses on equity. I wish we had one more hour though, because I think as we talk about the deployment and infrastructure side, you've got to talk about, and I think this is where Chris is going, but you got to talk about utilization and adoption. We can have this conversation in terms of, build it and people will come. Again, Randy, I've been doing this for 25 years, starting in the community tech center movement, which is where a lot of people know me from. You can build it, it doesn't mean they're going to show up. And so I think it's important for us to actually match these similar investments. And that's one of the things that the plan, I think, could have done it better on the Biden White House. How much money is going into adoption and utilization? How much money is going into local economic investment so that startups can be part of this local solution? We've got to go back to the drawing board. So to Tom's question, I think we can do better with smart minds around the table, but they got to come from every aspect of stakeholder that is affected by this.
Very good. So we are about out of time, and if we could just have one summary kind of observation, or maybe what we left out, kind of just along the lines what you were talking about, Nicole. Within 1 minute or so, to just as your final comments on what I think has been a very good discussion and very illuminating. But I'll just start with you, Randy, then Chris, then Nicole.
Well, first of all, thanks to David and Chris and Nicole. I think it has been a good session. I appreciate being part of the discussion. I'll just say to sum up that broadband, really is an important part of our lives now. I don't want to use that utility analogy because of all it implies, but I do want to see the government in the proper way and the appropriate way, in ways that I've talked about it. There's money that can be spent, and there are things the government can do to bring it to areas that don't presently have it, and to people that don't have it. And when I talk about the people that don't have it, I'm sensitive to the digital equity issues that Chris talked about. Obviously, we want everyone in America to be able to have it, and if we do it in the right ways. I just don't want to see, I think you can throw a lot of money at things sometimes and not end up using it very efficiently or effectively, and it's the again, money doesn't grow on trees, and so I like to think about it in terms of doing what we need to do in a careful way that targets the subsidies to those that need it and areas that need it.
Okay, Chris?
We didn't get to dive much into other ways to impact affordability beyond a long-term subsidy. That's the chief way, but certainly analyzing the actual costs to consumers and whether there's competition in the marketplace is essential to that. So I think there's more work to do there. And you would need, again, an FCC with actual authority over broadband to do that work. So we have a lot of work to do to restore the authority for an agency that says a lot about broadband to actually have the authority to do something about broadband. And why industry is afraid of that is beyond me, but I don't think consumers can wait any longer. I waited, 15 years for a World Series victory from the Washington Nationals. There are people who've been waiting for broadband longer than that. So we need to have a little bit of urgency in this town.
So I'll be quick because I can talk. I'll just say that the definition of chaos is doing the same thing over and over and over again. So I'm hoping that as we come out of this conversation and we do have this political will to do something different, that we just do something different. And I think we just come out of a national pilot that actually tells us what could potentially happen if we put the power of broadband in people's hands. And we have a national pilot that tells us how resilient our networks actually are right now. But I'm going to just say this, David, in my last 10 seconds. TPRC is virtual September 22nd to September 24th. So we're going back online, folks. So come on back and join us. And thanks to David, who is one of the co-chairs of the program committee, and Rosa Layton, who is the chair of the program committee, who are putting together, I think, a great array of conversations just like this. So thank you, David, for doing this, and Randy and Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.